Apparently I have to stand still because of the recording, so I'll stay in the one space, but it's very hard for me. First of all, to say thanks very much for having me here today, because as some of you know, I quit academia last year and then ended up coming back into it quite surprisingly, and I had been organising to come over at some stage because I had just finished the book Torture and Torturous Violence. So what I should have been doing was coming to talk about it, and instead I gave up the ghost and moved on for a bit. So here we are back, and I'm really, really glad to be here and thankful for that. And I am going to pick back up where I sort of left off last year, which is looking at torture and the limitations of the UN Convention Against Torture. So the first 4 slides that I'm going to go through, don't worry about reading them all, number one. I'm happy to send these slides around, and there's also some leaflets at the back that you can pick up and just take, which has got some of this in it. But effectively, I want 2 key points to come through. One is that borders compound the impacts of torture and facilitate further psychological implications. This research is, what I'm going to present is around 10 years of 3 projects. So that includes interviews with around 120 leading practitioners, and the Danish Institute Against Torture has kindly been my support in that time. And the second is, and I think what we should really be taking away from today, borders facilitate torture. Bordering facilitates and enables torture. States who are signed to the UN Convention Against Torture are subsequently effectively guilty of facilitating and enabling, if not actually undertaken. But I'm going to start first of all, and as I said, really don't go, read these first slides. They're just to set a context, which I thought would be a little bit helpful. But the UN Convention Against Torture focuses on 4 key facets. And the key facet that I want to discuss here is the role of the state in inflicting torture and the reasons behind why that torture is inflicted. So quite often organisations who work with survivors of torture respond only to those who have experienced torture, predominantly in custody. So we know that most people who are in custody are men, and so that makes sense that most organisations respond to torture in relation to male survivors of torture from mostly custody. What that leaves out then is the experiences of the many hundreds of women seeking asylum, and even more women because I used to be a director at a rape crisis as well. The many, many women, and also thinking of my own life trajectory, who have been subjected to violences which have the same or similar impacts as torture. So the UN Convention is fundamentally flawed if we follow it to practice. Now, of course, this is when I say don't read it all. There are other bodies and instigators which respond to domestic violence. There's been more discussions recently around that. And yet I would still say organisations predominantly, if not exclusively, work only within the UN Convention. So again, we have a narrow lens in responding to prevention as well as protection and subsequently support and rehabilitation. I don't like the term rehabilitation, but it's the term that's used at the organisations that I work with. So going to the torture-related projects and psychotraumatologists particularly that I was working with, if we take a look at Darius Rajali, and Darius has been quite an influence on a lot of this work, with his book Torture and Democracy, if anybody is familiar with it. And we've had some really good conversations actually about how we define torture. But effectively, Darius in his work has outlined many of these that we'll be familiar with in relation to wider contexts of torture, and also the aftermath of, in inverted commas, enhanced interrogation techniques. With people that I was working with, and this is what I think, and I'm going to focus on sort of the geopolitics of torture in a second, is many of the psychologists, and as I'll show in a second, people that I've worked with, had also, so in Denmark, Sweden and the UK, where I've been based on this is what some of the people have been subjected to. So we can see then that torture travels and the impacts of torture subsequently travel, and that's something that I want to come back to. So my key premise, and I've presented this to many, many scores of international lawyers and lawyers who work on torture prevention. So this is where there can be breaks between the law, I think, and my arguments, is to conceptualise torturous violence that moves us away from this legalistic framework. And actually, it's been really helpful to be working for these last 10 or 15 years with organisations, because this has started to, thankfully, influence who people allow to come through to get support in the aftermath of torturous violence. So this, for me, is sustained, psychologically impactful, and harms to the same or similar extent as violence, which is definably torture. To go on with that, it can be in familial relationships, interpersonal relationships, and if any of you do want to depress yourself desperately with the book, you will see that this comes through a lot of narratives where practitioners will say, well, yes, I know that this is an issue. However, it doesn't cover the law. It always comes back to the law. And so the key point of this is that it allows us to think about familial relationships. This is really key in working with people who have moved through borders and survived border-related violences, because this is often the situations that people experience it from, as well as conflict-related violence. That I spoke more about in the Gendered Harm book, so I'm not going to repeat myself. With women seeking asylum, and this is through oral histories, but also more than 500 hours of activist ethnographies with colleagues across, I've probably worked across about 50 organisations. Acid burns, more acid burns and hot water scalding than I would care to relay, in fact, and it's quite interesting how the banality of violence, the banality of torturous violence, just uses everyday forms of instruments, which I think also echoes Darius Rajali and Tobias Kelly's work on the banality of abuses, and also how difficult it is to subsequently evidence torture or torturous violence. But basically, we can see similar forms of abuses, whether we are looking at narrow definitions of torture or start to think about torturous violence in the context, particularly in my work, but not only, of women's lives. So this is the kind of platform of thinking of the globalisation of torture. So bringing about that facilitates the thorough discussion of various problems that attend a simple distinction between the global and the local. And I think that surviving torture and the experiences of torture and the impacts thereof really can be situated within the context of globalisation. Torture, though, does not only travel with torture regimes. I don't have time to go into this now, but one thing that I urge everybody to do is take a look through women's magazines. My mum is one for things like That's Life, Take a Break. And these are, when I did a kind of a surface level analysis of this a while back, and I just thought, this is just torturous abuse of women. Presented as, you know, the monster in the bedroom, that, you know, and actually take a look at that, because this is around us all of the time. The impacts of that is around us all of the time. So that also stops us thinking that torture is something which is a very strong narrative, included in some organisations in the UK. Torture is something that happens elsewhere. These countries in the global south, and there's a kind of racialised issue, I think, inherent to that as well. And actually, whenever we use the lens of torturous violence, this opens this out. But I want to bring this to the context of people who do move, and predominantly move from the global south and are increasingly made it more difficult to do so, is that effectively people who are seeking asylum, people who have refugee status, do not get to be victims. We see narratives of victimhood, but actually the impacts, the long-term psychological and physical impacts of this are not things that are responded to or acknowledged in the society around us, in institutions, in schools, or any of the highly problematic criminal injustice systems that we are akin to. That does not exist for this demographic. So let me get to key point one. Kieran, am I still all right for time? I'm one of those people who I just speed up, but I am aware that Northern Irish accents are not always the easiest to follow whenever we get enthusiastic. So 2 key points. Borders, and I am arguing this increasingly, and this is hopefully the next project that I would like to really be able to make an accessible, evidenceable database on this is that borders facilitate torture and torturous violence. And I'm going to show you some examples of that and what I mean. But we know this, again, in the context quite often of detention spaces. We know this in relation to, for example, camps. These are key sites of criminological research. And my colleagues, particularly Andriani Philly and Mary Bosworth at Border Criminologies with the Mobile Info Team and the Border Violence Monitoring Network. They've just recently done, so again, I'll share these slides and you can click on to this, evidence in violence in detention. So we've got these spaces, but again, this remains a kind of semi-carceral space and reiterates that state and quite often, and frankly, state corporate abuses against people. We can increasingly see that in asylum centres and other such spaces, we're able to evidence these. However, in working with, I've done research in immigration detention. I'm an immigration detention abolitionist, so I think it's fair to say, after many of the things that I've spoken out about and written, I will never be allowed back in immigration detention again. But effectively, we know that there are trajectories, continuums of violence which happen within these spaces. But my argument here is there are in fact 4 key ways in which borders facilitate torture and torturous violence. The first is something that I've really recognised in 16 years or something of researching with people seeking asylum, is that the way in which people are able to move has massively changed, or not move, has massively changed the experiences that people have on their way. So 15 years ago, I would be working with people from Darfur, from the DRC, from Eritrea, Pakistan. Increasingly, that shrunk because the capacity to be able to fly, obviously through various legislation since then, means that the clandestine movement has increased. So this is obviously very, very obvious to us, or it should be. However, I do find that practitioners who are in the field increasingly are not aware that this is directly, that the violence that people are subjected to is directly the outcome of the processes of bordering across Europe. And that's important whenever we start to think about the EU and its responsibilities, which will be my key slide at the end. The second, and these are some slides, these are just some quotes from some psychotraumatologists and psychologists who are working with. I find it interesting to work with psychologists because some have been there for 30 years and have seen the changes in regimes and border regimes and these kinds of patterns. Those who have not been there so long, this has become normalised, and I think we should denormalise that because it is the responsibility of states to recognise the role of borders in this. Increased exposure to avoidable traumata, and I say traumata because I think it is almost always multiple. It's very seldom singular, and that was a learning curve many years ago whenever I was focusing more on sexualised violence, is that this was one of very many traumata. So after the flight, so basically an intersectional continuum of abuses, and then through this asylum system, which I'm going to pick up on. And then the interplay between temporal harms of protracted journeys and temporal and spatial violence during asylum. So the longer that it takes to get somewhere, the more opportunities for violences and abuses increase. It is as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. It's not, it's not rocket science. So it's things that we are able to very easily evidence here. And then what we have, which I'm going to focus on afterward, is the impacts of protracted asylum systems and procedures. And then the long-term psychological impacts of exposure to life-threatening circumstances at borders. And of course, that is in particular in the precarious journeys that people take across, or forced to take across Europe, including by sea. So it's really interesting to work with, for example, therapists, physiotherapists, speech therapists, and even sometimes exposure therapists, because things like water, having a desperate fear of water is not something that is compatible with your everyday life. You cannot, it relates to other forms of personal harms, interpersonal harms, and relational harms. For example, people don't want to wash. this becomes serious, like this becomes medical issues. So again, all easily traceable and mappable to things such as fear of the sea, which is, fear of the sea and the fear of water and how that becomes part of everyday life. I've even known people to not want to drink because of their fear of water in the aftermath of crossing borders. So, these are just things that I think are should be obvious, but in fact they're not until we sort of scrape, take the wallpaper behind it. The second key point is that the impacts of bordering on survivors of torture and torturous violence is increasingly problematic, and it is almost always, I think, the central. So for all of the Nordic exceptionalism that we are familiar with, obviously, in criminology, the experiences of people who were in Denmark and that I did ethnographic and activist-based researches with were just, it was, I don't have time to go into it now, but I've put some articles here that you can access to take a look at what things were like. But one of the things that they decided to do was that they named Syria a safe space for return. And so literally, like the day after, so they determined Aleppo to be safe to return people who were who had refugee status and who were seeking asylum, because they also reduced the length of time refugee status would be. So it wasn't indefinite. It was, I think, 13 months, if I remember rightly. So literally, so you've got psychologists, and this is where it becomes a kind of side key point that I think we should all have here, is this is everybody's problem. If you're working in any kind of capacity, whether you're a teacher or a lecturer, or we have our border regimes in the university, the neoliberal university. If you're a psychologist working with survivors of violence, then your main objective is to support people in the context of violence. And that term rehabilitation is used in psychology and psychotraumatology, and again, not something that I massively am a fan of. But that aside, is effectively, as laws change, the impacts on survivors were immediate. So the day that somebody says, now we're going to remove people to Syria, the next day, survivors immediately unable to engage in an actually incredibly complex process of support in the aftermath of torture. So that's a direct border and outcome that then impacts, that just derails somebody from their everyday. And for psychologists or anybody working with survivors, whether we know and identify survivors or not, this is a problem for all of us, because these borders impact on how people can go about in their everyday. So that is for all of us here. Sometimes we're not able to do treatments because, and this was another really interesting thing, and it's really helpful to feed back with practitioners, because practitioners are also often alone. A bit like whenever you're if you've been lecturing, or if you're in your, I know there's other practitioners here as well. You don't know that there's things that are a problem for everybody. you individualize things or think, God, that's terrible for this person or whatever. Suddenly people realize, actually, this is a problem for all people, things like not being able to pay for transport, having unnecessary, home office or, migration vacate, wherever, signing things, like things that just constantly get in the way of being able to access support. I'm not going to go through all of these, but here's 5. These are 5 open, accessible articles and book chapters where I've documented all of this in much more depth. And actually, I didn't realise that it went from A to E. It's actually in alphabetical order until my colleague, the great Ergun Kakal, who does great work on torture from a legal perspective, pointed out to me. So there we are. It's but these are the things that are part of that every day, which impacts on people's capacity to, or right, or freedom to be able to engage in so many things that, going back, I am a semiologist, not really a criminologist. I work from a social harm lens, is that these harms that are completely avoidable become manifest emotionally, psychologically, temporally, and sometimes even over long periods of time medically as well. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but that's in this here. So let me conclude then, because this again brings me back to saying that this is an issue for all of us, is, to me, and this is obviously a law school, I am also in a law school, so I'm often in conflict with not the law necessarily, but lawyers, is my conclusion of 15 years of these projects is that, and I think yesterday's actually plenary beginning, is just endless evidence that international law is failing endemically. But I want to push it further than that as well, which is that this impacts on all practitioners. It impacts on anybody working with in civil society who are working with survivors, whether we know it or not. But it also brings us to thinking about responsibility, because I don't think I was thinking about this when we were discussing yesterday about bystander states. These are not bystander states. These are actively implementing forms of harms and violence which then translate into the capacity to be abused and to facilitate further forms of torturous violence. So that is not the same as bystander. That is actively enabling, profiteering from, financiering the abuses of people through bordering. So this brings me to the key conclusion, is that given that all 57 of the states aligned with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe have ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, then the fact that it proliferates is something that we should step away from the idea of being bystanders, but actually directly undermines the roles that those same states have in preventing torture, responding to torture, and ensuring that borders are not sites in which significant, prolific amounts of torture and torturous violence are enabled and enacted. So I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and super disciplined on time as well. Our second plenary speaker today is Teresa Degenhardt, a colleague of mine here at Queen's. Teresa is a senior lecturer in criminology and a fellow at the Mitchell Institute as well. Her interests are in the processes of criminalisation and securitisation in the international sphere, combining criminology with international relations. Her most recent, and I can say this having read it, quite brilliant book, War as Protection and Punishment, Armed International Intervention at the End of History, was recently published by Routledge, and she's currently working on a follow-up on immigration detention in Europe at the times of COVID with a number of colleagues to be published by Bristol University Press. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kieran, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here presenting this book, which is not on sale, by the way, in the context of the Irish Criminology Conference. Ireland is home to me now, and I migrated here 20 years ago this year. So it's really special for me to be presenting here and with the colleagues, critical colleagues like Vicky and Chris Lasslett, and with the chair today. I've learned a lot from scholars, students, and activists who are based here, so it is really special. Also, I would like to say that I would have liked to greet you with the local language, but that is still beyond me. The colonizer one is already a struggle. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to talk about the book, as mentioned, which is titled War as Protection and Punishment, Armed International Intervention at the End of History. It wishes to situate itself within the punishment and society literature with the aim of expanding the field. So the punishment and society literature starts from the main assumption that punishment is not just a consequence of a criminal action, but it is actually a social institution through which we can detect social relations, and in particular we can see the manifestation of power, authority, the drawing of borders of the community, as well as the emotional scripts. So punishment usually follows specific mentalities and culture of the time. Usually when we talk about punishment, we refer to the national dimension. Instead, I've tried to think about punishment within a globalized concept and in a specific historical time that Fukuyama defined as at the end of history. that time which came at the end of the Cold War and which was meant to be a time of only expansion of democracy, market societies, and the notion of human rights. Now, today there are many scholars working on crimes of war, on punishment following conflict or authoritarian regimes in transitional justice, and colleagues who work on the International Criminal Justice Court. These are very important studies. However, they tend to be based on the formal procedures that underpin international criminal justice. Instead, I argue it might be also important to think about the ways in which informal processes and discourses and practices are associated with discourses of crime and justice in the international. My argument in the book is that the book tries to make the analysis of the role of military interventions in the expansion of what I called an international penal ensemble. And by that I mean a specific way of thinking, acting, and a specific form of practices and institutions by which we think about crime and justice in the international sphere. My argument is that basically, these three examples of military intervention that I've analyzed fundamentally worked as ways of redressing human rights violations in foreign land and as a form of punishment for criminal regimes or criminal tyrant. But effectively, they've contributed to integrating new territory within the Western global state and expanding the borders of liberal societies. In this context, I talk about a Western liberal state rather than global North because I want to emphasize the liberalism that underpins this project. The fact that the US and the UK, which are the country leading these interventions I've analyzed, are imposing a liberal way of thinking rather than being just representative of the extreme wealth in the globe. But I have to say that global North and global West do intersect, and at times they can be seen as interchangeable. So in the book, I've analyzed discourses and practices in specific, as I said, in relation to these three conflicts: Kosovo, 1999, Iraq, 2003, and Libya, 2011. So, looking at the narrative in the UK and US leaders' political speeches, I trace some sort of an arc of legitimation of international criminal justice substantially. Analyzing the discourses on Kosovo, some of you might remember that image was quite a dominant image at the time. The emphasis was on the victims of Milosevic brutality, and the discourse were very much emphasizing the need to intervene underpinned by humanitarian sentiments. I'm talking there of Tony Blair as Prime Minister of the UK and at the time Bill Clinton in the US. In Iraq in 2003, and again some of you might remember, the emphasis was on the threat of Saddam Hussein, this was immediately after 9/11 to some extent. The discourse started to be built up at around 2002. Saddam Hussein was seen as a threat because he was said to detain weapons of mass destruction that he could have either sold to Osama bin Laden or used against the West in a space of 45 minutes, as you can see there in the image. Now, obviously, we know now that was all that was a lie. It was a made-up dossier to support the neocons' interest in Iraq. However, within this discourse, there was a lot of emphasis also on the fact that Saddam Hussein was a tyrant who had acted very violently against part of its population in the 80s. And prominent NGOs, such as Human Rights Watch, for instance, supported the intervention because the view was we needed to get rid of this dictator for the safety of Iraqis, not just for the security of the West. So human rights ideas and humanitarian sentiments were also quite prominent in these political speeches. In Libya, 2011, a much more recent one, you can see the images very different. If the first two kind of invasions, the first two military interventions, liberal military interventions, were both launched in violation of the UN Charter. Neither of them had the approval of the UN Security Council. Libya was a different matter. In that context, Gaddafi's reaction to the so-called Arab Spring at the time was immediately labeled as too violent, as representing a form of crimes against humanity that the West needed to react against and intervene promptly. The UN referred the case very promptly to the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor of the time, Moreno Campo, immediately released an arrest warrant against Gaddafi, the Colonel Gaddafi, Salif al-Islam, his son, and al-Senussi, the Minister of Interior of the time. So there's a clear difference in the ways in which this rationalization, this narrative of war, have built up the space for proper norms to become consolidated as a part of the international legal regimes. So these discourses could constitute both a form of a different framing, a rationalization of the use of military violence, forms of denial, strict denials in the case of Iraq, which was a clear war of aggression. But importantly to me, they highlight the role of emotions and what emotions can do. And I use the work of Sarah Hamed in his the cultural politics of emotion to talk about how effective emotions and affect can be in producing the world, in signaling power, in making some sort of power circulate. In this case, I argue that the denial of this rationalization was strengthened by the appropriation of the pain of the victims, which was made by these leaders who had kind of taken the self-evident tragedies and atrocities happening in these countries as a way to portray their intervention as the only possible intervention, the legitimate ways to use force. And they've used, to some extent, the metaphor of punishment. And we know that punishment is, in traditional political theory, the way in which force can legitimately be used to protect people's physical integrity. So they've legitimized, they've provided morality, they've provided kind of some sort of backing to their use of military force. And in doing that, both these practices and these discourses have consolidated a new norm, the responsibility to protect, which legitimized humanitarian military intervention and which was sanctioned by the UN General Assembly in 2005 and was used to actually intervene in Libya. So what I want to say is that these are not just political discourses that are aimed to manipulate our moral capacity and turn what is military violence, the violence of war, into a legitimate enterprise. These are also the product of the culture of our time. They are the product of our liberal minds. This is a time in which many of us at time had started to believe in the possibility of a globalized world, into a better world in which the notion of human rights was getting more and more purchased, and the sanctity of the individual was paramount. We also, at this time, have a very different perception of violence and what is legitimate violence. And importantly, as I said, it builds on our perception, our kind of vibrating with the victims of atrocities, with this feeling of outrage, the disgust for the violence, the emotional effervescence, as Sparks calls the kind of the punitive emotions of Durkheim, if you wish. Enable us to see how there is a tracing of new borders of the community. These discourses orient the public perceptions toward feeling sympathy for people who are in foreign countries who would be otherwise constructed as others compared to the national dimension. So it is a way in which we kind of sympathize with people who might otherwise not be perceived as us, and in doing so, we also ostracize and put the hatred against one part of the population which we identify as the offenders. So this kind of emotional, natural emotional effervescence that comes out of witnessing violence, even in the mediated form, is what makes us run into and go straight into the script of crime and justice, which is a quite powerful script in our societies, through which, as I said, force and violence is legitimized. So at this time, the state is no longer able to use military force in war to expand its power outside in different territories. But what is it using its military power for is to regulate states' behavior in other contexts. So what we have, what I trace here, is at the same time in which in kind of the US and the UK, for instance, in prominent Western states, we had a war on crime discourse and what some people called a decivilizing of punishment, an increased need or allegedly a desire from the population to punish strongly those who are perceived to be others and criminals. In the outside the nation sphere, we have a kind of a reverse kind of motion by which we have a crime and justice discourse, and the war is increasingly being civilized and regulated according to norms of international law. So what does what do this narrative do? What kind of relationship do they enable? And I'm not going to be able to talk about everything because it's too much. But if we look at the practices, so in the first picture, you can see a monument in Pristina in Kosovo, which symbolizes the novelty of the state. One of the results is that the Western power rebuilt the states in which they had intervened, and they rebuilt it according to the Northern and Western standard of order, producing institutions and inserting norms. The other impact, the other effect, is that I've traced in some soldiers' narratives the presence of just desert logics and feelings of righteousness that, to me, enabled the unleashing of violence and legitimated the unleashing of violence. This is taken from the chapter on Iraq, and I'm looking at the attack on Fallujah, a city in the Sunni Triangle, which was defined as a resistance city. And you can see there two quotations. One was taken from one of the messages given to the soldiers before they entered the city, showing how the city is represented through the crime idea that all the civilians are mugs, thugs, and murderers or intimidators. And then another one taken from a soldier's biography, who clearly remark the just desert or the revenge kind of narrative. These are, I want to go back. I'll wait. These are ways in which, if you want, we can see the righteous feeling that were legitimized by this common narrative, common perception of war as a form of punishment, and which eventually unleashed and enabled this form of domination and unleashing of violence on the model of what Jack Katz called righteous feeling that legitimate killing. Furthermore, all these interventions had at their end the establishment of courts and tribunals. You can see there Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, and Salif al-Islam. And these courts and tribunals further legitimate this narrative of this military intervention producing justice or being forms of enforcing ways of enforcing international law. Through this that I call rights of institutions, the West is substantially legitimated. The audience is called to agree with what appears to be a neutral tool, the law, and to associate themselves with those who are establishing justice in the process. These perpetrators are cast as outsiders, and I don't mean to say that they were good people. I'm just saying that this is something that is happening. And we are called, and we and in the countries which were integrated in this kind of global Western state are joining or are called to join in the condemnation and in the legitimation of the metropole, the Western, global, and Northern state, subjecting, therefore, their population to its symbolic power. This, to me, remind us of the coloniality of penalty, although I haven't spoken about it here, but in the book, in each chapter, what is evident is that there are a lot of friction, tensions, and conflict in the process, and that these are far from perfect, exercise practices. So just to conclude, I think I rationalize, I situate this into the context of globalizing processes, a context, a particular historical context in which borders were being blurred, the idea of punishment and war were becoming, were seen as overlapping. And I see these as ways in which maybe justice is being reformulated. According to Fraser's, this is the stage in which the who, the what, and the how of justice are being no longer valid and are producing abnormal forms of justice. So this stress again the coloniality of punishment to me, the way in which humanitarian interventions were forms of colonial intervention, but also the way in which punishment is entangled with what Laurent Berlan calls the utopia of law. So the fantasy that law or punishment might redress pain and harm for the good life. But in doing so, it abandons and leave the offender to the process of social violence. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was a spirited effort to summarise a book in 20 minutes, which is no mean feat. Our final speaker in this plenary session is Professor Kristian Lasslett, who's Professor of Criminology at Ulster University and co-founder of the International State Crime Initiative. His research focuses on using investigative methods to document and analyse the complex transnational schemes used to execute serious economic crime, the associated methods used by elite operatives to conceal illicit activity, launder reputations and elude accountability mechanisms. The title of his talk is Unaccountable, Privileged and Fearless, Investigating the Crimes of the Ultra-High Network Individuals. Chris, over to you.
All right, thanks everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to begin with a kind of a politician's apology, where I'm saying sorry but not really sorry, where I'm going to have to be a bit tethered to a script. And the reason for that is that, as we know in criminology, we've often not looked at the affairs of the bourgeoisie, as they don't like to be known. But unfortunately, when you do, they have a team of lawyer monkeys who they have on retainer, who can be sent flying out the proverbial window, even when a minuscule, irrelevant academic like me at a conference like this says something that offends them. And if you're thinking I'm exaggerating, I've had summons to the courts before with quotes from talks I've given. So I now tend to be a little bit cautious, and this has all been legally vetted by my legal team. So strap yourselves in for a fun time as I read from a script, and I don't depart at all from it. So today I'm going to dig a little into the devices that elite networks use to discreetly and misleadingly structure their business affairs. Now, I call these devices authorised fictions because they are state-sanctioned tools which allow their users to generate virtual structures and transactions with quite unnerving levels of creative freedom. And I've been studying authorised fictions most recently as part of an investigation into how a network of closely linked, politically exposed persons with ties to the Kremlin have discreetly secured a significant chunk of Uzbekistan's gas and oil wealth. So probably as soon as I say the word something like Kremlin, oil and gas wealth, you can understand that, you know, there's lawyers out there going, whoa, this could be profitable for me. So hence I'm sticking to the script, and I just departed from it, which was probably my first going to incur problems. But in this paper, I'm going to consider how this network that I've been investigating have used authorised fictions to conceal their operations. So to kick things off, I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to investigate this network. It began in 2022 when I received a series of emails. Each email came from a different address, but was signed off by someone using the pseudonym Neil. I think they thought because I was at Ulster University, I was Irish, so they affectionately used the pseudonym Neil. Neil told me he had a cache of documents that evidenced a rather murky scheme which had been authored by senior security service generals in Uzbekistan and their partners in the Kremlin. Together, he claimed, they had successfully captured and exploited some of the most lucrative economic nodes in Uzbekistan's hydrocarbon sector. So following an extensive email exchange, Neil began sending me the leaked documents. Now, in this kind of scenario, you have to obviously carefully authenticate the documents and supplement them through further independent inquiry. And that is what I did in collaboration with some colleagues at Radio Ozodlik, which is an investigative media outlet. The evidence we collated pointed to a number of core conclusions. First, there was indeed a network of closely interlinked actors that included on the Russian side the prominent sanctioned businessman, Gennady Timchenko, as well as sanctioned executives from Gazprom Bank. On the Uzbek side, the network included two men, Sharif and Ravshan, who are the sons of General Umar Abuldayev and Colonel General Rustam Iniatev. Until recently, both Abuldayev and Iniatev were senior security service commanders in Uzbekistan. Working alongside their sons, Sharif and Ravshan, in this network was a local business partner, an innocuous but important executive from Samarkand named Bakhtiyor Fazilov. Now, on the basis of our inquiry, it appeared that since 2016, this network and the businesses they're tied to had secured a monopoly over major new gas and oil fields in Uzbekistan, which had been developed primarily through 50-50 joint ventures with the Uzbekistani state. Funding for these upstream developments had ostensibly come from Gazprom Bank loans, and this is before Gazprom Bank had been sanctioned. But a leaked internal government inquiry from Uzbekistan indicated key loans were being repaid through the discounted sale of state-owned gas to the network, who then exported it abroad for profits, which were then being used to pay back the loans. So in effect, the cost of gas extraction was being disproportionately paid for by the government of Uzbekistan by letting its gas go cheaply and not the so-called private investors who I've just referred to. The evidence also indicated that drilling and construction work being done by this network, both for these joint ventures and other state-owned projects in Uzbekistan, were being charged at inflated prices. And then finally, the data pointed to the fact that the network was involved in oil and gas trading arbitrage. On the one hand, they were, as I mentioned, buying gas at a low price from the state in Uzbekistan and selling it for a higher price abroad. And then on the other hand, the network was also buying oil from abroad and selling it at high prices to state-owned refineries in Uzbekistan. So in summary, we found that a series of businesses had captured and exploited in what appears to be a predatory manner significant strategic points in the gas and oil supply chain in Uzbekistan, and these businesses were tied to a network of politically exposed and sanctioned persons. But now what I'd like to do is show how this network has projected a corporate and financial structure that in effect conceals these material realities using a series of what I call authorised fictions. So to begin peeling back what I mean by authorised fictions, it's a fairly obvious observation to make that the organisational form around which the global economy today pivots is the limited liability company. Limited liability companies can, of course, be generated fairly effortlessly by participating in a series of codified rituals that generate the incorporated entity, which the state authorises to act as a legal person. But this process not only allows its users to generate a corporate avatar, if you will, through which to conduct their business, these corporate avatars can be created anywhere in the world with little more than easily purchased nominal presence in the country. So not only do systems of incorporation permit the creation of corporate avatars, or indeed multiple corporate avatars, these corporate avatars can be created anywhere in the world. With little more, can be created anywhere with little more than an easily purchased nominal presence in the country. Sorry, I just went over the line. This is me not being good at doing scripture things. So not only do you have systems of incorporation that permit the creation of corporate avatars, or indeed multiple corporate avatars, these avatars can be generated pretty much in any jurisdiction the user pleases. From a chair in Belfast, we can within a few days generate a multinational corporate structure with complex layers interlinked through 20 jurisdictions. But this is not the only authorised fiction that can be used to conduct business and manage wealth. The trust is another legal structure that is broadly recognised in many jurisdictions around the world. And here, through another well-established set of rituals, individuals can spawn another quite novel happening. I, as a settler, can grant property to a trust, which is a recognised legal entity. A trustee is then appointed who will formally own the assets and will then employ these assets for designated beneficiaries according to the trust deed. So in effect then, not only can we generate corporate avatars, we can also generate human avatars to hold assets. And then talented professionals can blend these different authorised fictions together in complex ways. Through the virtual landscape that then this opens up, it is possible to use other commercial tools in order to generate further simulated transactions. For example, through a series of international loans issued between different related shell companies at a nominal rate of interest, the apparent source of funds for a transaction and the actual sources of funds for a transaction can be quite legally separated. And when pulled together, these different tools allow networks of actors to generate what is in effect a simulated corporate, financial and ownership structure, which may depart in a minor manner or quite a significant manner from the actual material people and transactions which these structures represent. Now, as I said before, these are authorised fictions. They are created by users through a certain codified ritual, such as filing in incorporation forms, providing certain identification, after which a certificate of incorporation is then issued by the state. And through this process, corporate avatars are stamped by the state with what Bourdieu calls its meta-capital. The state has an ability to say at a universal level, this is real and is to be accepted as such. A determination that is then further consecrated by other institutions, such as courts and banks, who accept and confirm these declarations. So through this process of authorisation and consecration, quite elaborate avatars and simulated structures are ordained as authentic fictions, and which we must accept and respond to as if they were materially real. And in compounding matters in this regard, we, the ordinary masses, are by and large not permitted to inspect or scrutinise the material reality behind these authorised corporate and financial simulations. In some jurisdictions like the UK, it's true, companies and public corporations must submit documents that disclose some of the material reality, although often they are of questionable veracity. But in other jurisdictions, such as the British Virgin Islands, the public are repelled from accessing anything of any material substance, such as financial filings or share registers. Then if we cast our eyes to other documents that might allow the public to see what lies behind these authorised fictions, such as trust deeds or a loan agreement, these are all figuratively stamped as private, and so they are only accessible to select individuals. As a result, elite actors on the one hand enjoy the creative powers that come from publicly authorised fictions, but also benefit from the privacy firewalls that protect their material activities from being publicly inspected. And so it follows in this very fortified situation that any attempt to question these consecrated, authorised simulation becomes a modern-day act of heresy. It is heretical because persons of low symbolic status are questioning fictions that are sanctified and consecrated by authorities with a much higher accumulation of symbolic capital. So if a regular person alleges that corporate and individual avatars are being used to generate an illusion that conceals something quite sinister beneath, it is a scandalous thing to do. And the affected parties have full recourse to the courts in order to punish these heretics for questioning ordained fictions through, for example, a libel action, which I would know nothing about. Now, the network that I introduced you to earlier make proactive use of corporate and human avatars to generate structures that allow them to avoid unwanted attention. Now, this unwanted attention would include from the US, Ukraine, and its allies who are looking to disrupt Kremlin capacity through sanctions regimes. Then there is the Uzbekistani public, who have little desire to be an economic satellite of an imperial power like Russia, and who deplore their own political elites profiteering at their expense. And finally, there is Uzbekistan's own elite stratas, which are not homogenous. There exist rival power groupings, unhappy with the reach of the security services and their friends in the Kremlin. So the capture of Uzbekistan's gas and oil sector by this network has needed to be conducted through an edifice of authorised fictions that would not trigger disruptive reactions from these different constituencies. In order to do this, the Russo-Uzbek network that I outlined before established avatars for their operations by incorporating distinct entities in the jurisdictions of Jersey, Cyprus, Hong Kong, Singapore, Scotland, Switzerland and Russia. What this meant is a coordinated effort to capture significant energy interests in Uzbekistan was being conducted through a series of seemingly unconnected entities. Then, when I began investigating the corporate filings for these different entities, a further set of human and corporate avatars appeared, which initially blocked my vision of the substantive figures behind this business structure. For example, the shares in this consortium of companies were legally owned by a number of executives involved in administering different aspects of the overarching business structure. This included people like Bakhtiyor Fazilov, Bahadir Ghafarov, Sanjar Samiev and Denis Narenko, along with a number of corporate nominee shareholders. In the case of Bakhtiyor Fazilov, while our research indicates he is in part an avatar who holds property on trust for others, he is publicly presented as a tycoon controlling a multi-billion-dollar energy empire that spans Uzbekistan and Russia. And that is despite him lacking many of the credentials that would ordinarily be required to secure this lucrative position in the region. Another dimension of the simulated structure projected by this network centres on finance. On paper, the joint venture involved in tapping new gas and oil fields were being financed by Gazprom Bank. This concealed, for example, that in the case of gas field development, finance was actually coming from Ariel, one of the network's key corporate vehicles used for drilling operations. This finance was then loaned to the joint ventures through the auspices of Gazprom Bank on the privately stated condition that the joint ventures use the money to pay Ariel, the one who loaned it, in the background, to drill the gas fields at what appeared excessive prices. So by early 2023, my partners at Radio Ozodlik and I were prepared to utter some heresy and publicly question the authorised fictions that are constitutive of this corporate, financial and human structure, which we believe concealed something quite problematic. And given our lowly symbolic status, we contacted a London law firm to help shield us from attack. And as part of building that protective shield, we had to submit the substance of our findings to key figures from the network so they could respond. On occasions, their response was interesting. Bakhtiyor Fazilov wrote back as the principal shareholder and chairman of Ariel, stating, "We were surprised with this is his quote, "We were surprised with the level of unprovoked aggression, insinuations and incorrect factual infuriations that you provided in your letter. We hope that you and the University of Ulster, which you represent, will not disseminate or publicise rumours and incorrect and misleading information that you have stated. We hereby confirm to you that your information is grossly incorrect, inaccurate and incomplete. Any conclusion or analysis that is based on this information will be equally and increasingly inaccurate, misleading and incorrect. Regarding answering your questions, due to the confidential nature of business relations, we unfortunately cannot answer your questions. We ask you to show this letter to the Legal Counsel of Ulster University, whom of course you represent here, and require them to consider the legal and reputational consequences of publishing this information." Now, the threat in this email came as no surprise, and neither did Fazilov's refusal to say anything of substance. Because, of course, he does not need to say anything, as it's the authorised fictions which enjoy official legitimacy. So following that exchange with Fazilov on February 9th last year, the investigation results were published. Radio Ozodlik broadcast a 90-minute expose, and within a few days the documentary had generated millions of views across YouTube and Telegram. But as a regional journalist noted with curiosity, following the expose, not a single media outlet or blogger in Uzbekistan mentioned the story. The silence was likely a result of both self-censorship and explicit warnings issued by the Uzbek security services. Last page. Following this period of silence, a team of hand-picked journalists and bloggers were brought to the Energy Ministry in Tashkent to hear the quote-unquote truth, which of course involved the denial of any exposure to Kremlin or security service networks, and which rejected any suggestion of corporate profiteering. These statements were then reported across the Uzbek media, but with curiously little information on the original story that these denials were responding to. Several months later, the Russo-Uzbek network began a notable process of shutting down the corporate holding companies that the investigation had successfully linked to Chimchenko and the now sanctioned Gazprom Bank. So, for example, the Russian company Forus, which was being used for midstream operations in Uzbekistan, was replaced by the Hong Kong entity Daxon Holding Limited, owned by none other than Bakhtiyor Fazilov now. And during the same period, the key financial and drilling organ used by the network, Ariel, based in Germany, removed its now tainted parent entity from Jersey and relocated it to Hong Kong, where it became owned by a young Hussein Rashidi, a former seafood restaurant waiter, now working as a sales manager at the Ariel Group. As a result, the corporate and individual avatars that had infected the clean corporate and financial image projected by this group, used by this group using authorised fictions, were rapidly dissolved, and a new set of avatars were generated overnight. So by way of conclusion, I just want to reflect a little on this case and what it tells us. If we consider it from a case study perspective, this is what we might call a most likely case, where because of the networks involved and the interests they represent, there is a strong motivation for powerful Western institutions to discredit the corporate and financial simulation projected by this group and to call out the predatory activities beneath. But this assumption runs into tensions. Put simply, the Western elite enjoy being able to create virtual structures internationally that allow them to lawfully avoid taxes, liability, regulations and scrutiny. So these authorised fictions are critical to regimes of privilege and unaccountability that elite actors today thrive on, from west to east and north to south. And so it follows that these authorised fictions, such as offshore corporations and trusts, must be baked into our world as inherent and socially immovable, rather than as something temporal and dissolvable. And it seems that their immovable nature must be respected, even when flagrantly and openly abused by the quote-unquote enemy of the West, a contradiction that Kremligarchs will happily exploit. So in a sense, and while the commoners during the feudal period had to observe religious scriptures dictated to them by the ruling class, the commoners today must give the same level of reverence to the bourgeoisie scriptures and a pantheon of authorised fictions which we must all honour as if they were real. And this allows members of the bourgeoisie, whether they are Russian, Uzbek, British, Australian or Irish, to act through these sacred avatars in a manner that further amplifies their agency powers to navigate the current orders in ways that reproduce their harmful rule over the multitudes. Thank you, and sorry for being so scripted.